Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 2024 book by Erik Larson, The Demon of Unrest, a saga of hubris, heartbreak, and heroism at the dawn of the Civil War. Erik Larson, relatively well-known non-fiction writer, native of New York initially, ended up majoring in journalism, studied journalism, and practiced it for a long time. Became a features writer for various different news outlets and publications, and really made his kind of bread starting in around the late 80s and 90s with his work in writing nonfiction books. You start seeing examples of this coming out in the early 90s with some of his first books, and eventually these books start, two things start happening. Number one, the books start gaining this character of being very intensive deep dives into specific historic events. So, for instance, you have the Galveston hurricane, you have the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, the sinking of the Lusitania, and things like that. All these sorts of deep dives and these very vivid portrayals of very specific events that sometimes are frequently covered and sometimes aren't. But ultimately, Larson finds this way to make these portraits and these events very three-dimensional. Now, the second piece with that is with this focus, these sort of like long-form, intense journalism pieces transformed into books, came popularity, essentially. A lot of Larson's books are regarded as among the best sort of investigative nonfiction works of the last 20 to 30 years. I mean, consistently highly reviewed, consistent bestsellers, and really just, staples of pretty much any nonfiction section in any bookstore you go into. I cannot count the amount of times that I have seen an Erik Larson book, if not multiple books, on the shelves in one place. Now, I happen to own a few of Erik Larson's books. I own The Devil in the White City about the Chicago World's Fair. I own Dead Wake about the Lusitania sinking. But this one right here, The Demon of Unrest, was actually the first one that I have gotten around to opening because it's the one that makes the most sense from a chronological standpoint with this project. Now, this also happens to be his most recent book, coming out about 6-8 months ago as I'm recording this review, about 7 months ago, it looks like. And like the other ones, this has been consistently well reviewed, and it's really no wonder why. I mean, I'll start with perhaps the obvious by saying that this book is excellent. And it's kind of, in a way, not miraculous that it's excellent, but it's interesting in how it managed to stand out, because this is maybe one of the most talked about periods of time that Larson has ever written about. In this case, the unrest that's in question is the kind of immediate lead up to the Civil War. The Demon of Unrest takes place in the about 5-month period or so between the 1860 presidential election and the firing the first shots at Fort Sumter in April 1861. And during that time, obviously, a huge chain of events happened. I think anyone with even remedial knowledge of U.S. history will understand that that period of time was extremely significant, with the secession of numerous states, the assassination plots surrounding Lincoln, and just all the kind of buildup and the withholding of supplies from the actual fort right up until the Confederates fired the first shot. I think everyone knows that this was a tenuous period in U.S. history, but it is so interesting how Larson chooses to tell this story. Not necessarily in a way that's radically different from what you might expect, especially if you understand what Larson is skilled at as a writer and what the appeal of his previous books have been. This is a book that is very heavy on character portraits. So you have kind of these central characters who you are following along as the events kind of happen, these major figures in and around the fort itself, these major political figures on both the Union side and the Confederate side, and these other figures who serve to kind of emphasize the moral quandary behind it. There's a lot of grappling with ideas here. There's the grappling between loyalty to your community, to your state, to your family, to your ideals, while also grappling with kind of the morals surrounding slavery, the morals surrounding femininity and the act of marriage. The character of Mary Chestnut, I think, is a really interesting follow, kind of seeing her reflections and her experience throughout this time. And it makes the whole piece so vivid and lifelike and makes it feel very present. And I think that presence and that sense that, this feels like something that is not removed from our reality. This is something that, in the grand scheme of things, happened very recently. I think that's illustrated really heavily in the kind of preamble to the book, in the introduction. I don't think that Larson is heavy-handed in his comparison between the events of November 1860 to April 1861 and the events following the 2020 election. But he makes the comparison. Right off the bat, it's one of the first things that he says is talking about how he was already in the middle of writing the book when January 6th happened, and how that experience informed how he was going to tell the story and informed the necessity of the book because of the parallels between that time and now. And again, right, a lot of people make those comparisons as far as how tenuous the American political climate is. I've even talked about it on this channel before, I'm pretty sure. It's not new ground. But again, Larson, I think, very consciously makes it so that, his messaging is not heavy-handed. I think that's the only time he mentions January 6th or contemporary politics really at all in the narrative. And instead, you get to spend this time with these characters where these words have been pulled from diaries and letters and that sort of thing. And you're made to feel like they are, characters of the present in a way. And that alone does wonders. And the irony's not lost that part of the tension building in this era was the question about whether or not the election results would actually be certified because of how much political and social unrest was around and the threat for violent uprisings. That is called out very clearly, and that's not unique to this book. This is also called out in other books, other Lincoln biographies that I read and that sort of thing. But I think this is the one that really hones in on that aspect of it. The idea that, in theory, had things gone somewhat differently, the 1860 election results might not have been certified, and we could have been looking at a very different outcome, a very different war, and a completely different country. And that piece, I think, is interesting to kind of reflect on. Yeah, I think it's written effectively. I think, like I said, Larson's a very vivid writer, very accessible writer. I thought it was interesting how he kind of focused on the propaganda wars, I suppose, that were going on. One point that's talked about in every Civil War history is, of course, the role of propaganda, if you want to call it that, because that's technically what it is, of messaging and that sort of thing in the abolitionist side of things. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the various narratives written by different enslaved people, different people who supported the abolitionist movement, how their messaging influenced the discourse. But I think this book does an interesting job of focusing a lot of attention on the pro-slavery propaganda too, especially during this time. What was the messaging going out to these kind of white Southerners? What was being communicated to kind of fuel those fires? These different novelists, these different writers and journalists who are stoking the flames by making incendiary claims about how there's going to be a slave uprising or a you-know-what uprising because Lincoln is president now. Like, sitting with that narrative for a bit, I think is interesting because, again, it just, even if it's not the same exact rhetoric that you see applied in more contemporary situations, it's still worth noting how that ecosystem worked. And just because the sands of time have made those opinions outdated and we've wanted to move on from them, justifiably so, doesn't mean that we can ignore them if we want to learn from what was going on and better understand the kind of massive propaganda waves, both physically and digitally, that we have in this day and age. So if there's an overall conclusion to come to with this narrative, I don't know if the narrative gives you a conclusion, but I can at least give you a conclusion on what I think about it, which is that it's excellently done, it's topical, and I'm always nervous a little bit when talking about these topical sorts of things because they can get heavy-handed, they can get to the point of preaching and that sort of thing. I have called that out in reviews of other books, not even politically related books, that go on diatribes about things that don't seem particularly relevant or don't seem that they will age well in any sort of way. And I think Larson knows to avoid that. And I really respect that. And I think this book is excellent. I would say if you're fans of his other work, like I said, I've not read his other work at this point, although I plan on it. I cannot imagine this is any sort of a decline. This is noticeably worse in any way. I think this is superb, a great bit of history, one of the most compelling books that I've read this year, if I'm being honest. And yeah, highly recommend it. Go check it out wherever you get your books. And with that, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time, right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.